All right, well, welcome everybody to this month's OWASP Nashville meeting. We are featured here with Ross Young, who is the CISO of Caterpillar Financial, a former divisional CISO of Capital One, and a close friend of mine, as well as a associate SANS instructor. Second, Ross, were you wanting to chime in? I see that you unmuted.
Oh, no, go ahead.
All right, no worries. So our mission is to cultivate a vibrant, technically astute security culture in Nashville. You know the deal. We have to have a cool mission for OWASP. For those who are not familiar with OWASP, it is the Open Web Application Security Project, and we're trying to replicate that here in Nashville. We honestly have not been as active as we would like. We all know that there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the world post this scenario we have. And it's not nearly as fun as when we used to get together and have awesome pizza and drinks. But we're going to try our best to bring you more events in the near future. And of course, as always, if you'd like to join us and support us, here's how to register for OWASP, and you can specify the chapter that you want your dues to go to, in this case, Nashville. Here are the leaders of our group: Mark Gieslin, Joel Tomasini, Casey Orsini, and myself, Brandon Evans. One thing that we've added basically this past weekend is a call for papers. One thing that we want to do in order to ensure that we have more quality content for this chapter is to solicit some awesome talks from you all in a way that will allow for us to onboard these talks in a quick fashion. So Paper Call is an awesome program. If you've never seen it before, it allows for you to submit talks, and we're going to have it wide open forever. You can submit talks, and we will try to get you on our schedule at our nearest available time. And right now, the calendar is wide open. So if folks want to talk about a security topic right here in Nashville, by all means, please do submit to our brand new Paper Call. We actually do have an upcoming event as of this morning on the calendar, so that's cool. We are going to be doing a secure coding tournament with Secure Code Warrior. For those who are not familiar with Secure Code Warrior, they are a SaaS tool that allows for you to provide your developers with insecure code. They would be able to identify that insecure code and supply potential solutions to fix the code. And Secure Code Warrior has graciously offered to provide a free tournament for our members. So this will be happening on May 4th. May the 4th be with you. We will be posting a meetup for that shortly. And without further ado, I've already basically introduced him, but Ross, take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Oh, you got to stop sharing. Perfect. All right, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So in case you haven't seen this before, I actually started this as a OWASP project. So if you just search for the threat and safeguard matrix, you'll hear it called the TaSM, like a TaSManian Devil, in case you want to read or learn more about what I'm talking about tonight at a later time. So let me just kind of to set the stage a little bit. My name's Ross Young. My background is I've done cybersecurity for 15 years, and I really had a lot of fun across a variety of places. I've had the chance to work at NSA. I spent over 10 years at CIA doing nation state hacking. And as Brandon mentioned, I'm currently the CISO at Caterpillar Financial here in Nashville. But I do a couple other things. One of my other favorite passions right now is I'm the host of CISO Tradecraft podcast. And it's been a really good opportunity to go and kind of give back. And when I stepped into my current role as the CISO for Caterpillar Financial, you know, what I really wanted to think about is how can I build a strategy that works for this organization? You know, there's a lot of things that you have to do. And when I think about cyber, the biggest statement I would say, and I hope you guys remember this, that cyber is really in the business of revenue protection, right? The company makes a lot of hard efforts to go and win the marketing dollars and actually do sales, but we're there to keep them safe. And if we can tie our work back to protecting their revenue, that tends to resonate really well with executives. And so, what are they worried about? They're worried about threats. And when you think about threats, about 90% of them are mostly going to be criminal activity to steal financial gain more than the nation state actors. And they have this term in cybersecurity called countermeasures, right? And this is a military term where we talk about how can we put some safeguards in place that actually reduce vulnerabilities, reduce the likelihood of attacks. And when I think about this, I often think about rock climbers. Now, I grew up in Las Vegas and I had a fantastic time there. And it's kind of a mecca for rock climbing. And so imagine this, the business in this case is a rock climber and they want to go climbing in this place here. And so they come and cybersecurity is really the park ranger in this scenario. If we tell the rock climber, no, you're never allowed to climb, they're just going to wait till we're not looking and climb without us. But if we say, okay, let me see your gear here. Let's look at your rope to make sure that can withstand a fall. Let's look at your harness to make sure that the stitchings are well in play. And we can kind of look through the gear to understand what they're doing to making sure that they have the appropriate countermeasures. So when they take this risky climb, they can actually survive a fall. And that's what we're going to be really talking about today, which is how do we safeguard and enable the business to make money and also provide them the revenue protection that they need. Now, when you think about risk mitigation, there's really four different things to think about. The business can accept the risk and say, don't care, I'm just going to do it. They can reject the risk and say, okay, we're not going to take this IT system and put in play. We're going to take it out of the environment. They can transfer the risk. So they may say, we're just going to buy cyber insurance. And, if it happens, it happens. But that's why we buy insurance, just like you would on a car. Or we're going to mitigate it. And this could be we're going to, patch some of the vulnerabilities. We're going to put a WAF in front of a web application, things where you could reduce the likelihood of an attack. But each of these are very trivial in nature. We're just saying we're going to do something. And when we start to think about risk in a bigger function, we need to understand that not everybody has the same appetite. And so we need to think about what a risk appetite is. We need to understand how much risk the business is willing to tolerate. We need to understand profiles. And most importantly, we need to understand what I would call timely, consistent, adequate, reasonable, and effective decisions. Essentially, if you ever work in a highly regulated environment, whatever decisions you make, you need to be able to defend against auditors, against regulators, and any other folks who would challenge your decisions. And so when we think of this, we have to take these high level concepts and really start to translate those for the business to understand what we're talking about in a very programmatic way that's very structured. And one way you see this happen in organizations is a risk matrix. And on one side, you're going to have the likelihood, where we could say something happens 4 times a month or it only happens once in 10 years. So obviously going to the right is much more likely. And then you're going to have a severity, also called a impact or consequence side, where you can say, really no worries at the bottom to catastrophic up top. And you can define this for your organization. So likelihood is normally shown in time. So how often per year it happens. And severity can be a variety of different ways. Here, this is taken, I believe, from FAA, where they're talking about different events. But you could also put it in terms of revenue, right? You could identify the cost of an application. And you might say, okay, let's just look at something like the Verizon data breach report. And we could say a record maybe is $160 per record. And you could times that by the number of records in your database. And that'd give you a ballpark estimate of how much you may have to pay in fines if it were lost and you had to deal with GDPR or some other type of compliance framework. But really what you're going to see here is we've color coded things to show where is it appropriate to take risks. And what I will say is you can always take risks, but with increased risk comes increased responsibility. And so over here at the bottom in this blue area, right, you could have someone who's a branch chief who could accept that risk because it's very low. As we move up, maybe you need a division chief who can accept over here. And now you need a group chief. And over here, now you need a vice president of an organization. And up at the very most top, maybe you need your executive risk committee. And so this is a way where we can start to identify what the risk appetite is for the organization of who can accept these risks and what level of approvals they need to go to. Now, what I found when I saw this is it makes a lot of sense to get the appropriate buy-off, but are we accepting risks without putting in the appropriate safeguards? Or are we going to think about how to build a defense in depth strategy? And when we start building a cybersecurity program, we can look at different things that are out there that help guide us, right? We have control frameworks like NIST 853 or the CIS top 20 controls. We have program frameworks, which is the ISO 27000 or NIST CSF. And these are two different things. So think of this as, hey, this is what you're going to have as a parts catalog, right? These are the different parts you have to put in an organization. A program framework is more like the assembly instructions, right? How do you put part A with part B and put everything together? And then you have the last thing, which is a risk framework, which takes the most amount of experience and the most amount of time to really apply and do it well. And this is where we're actually determining what do we need to do first when we're putting everything together, because not everything is the same. And so when we start to look at a couple different risk frameworks, here's one that the financial sector introduced. There's this place called FFIEC, and it's a group of all the financial regulators. So think of the Federal Reserve Board, Treasury's OCC, the Office of Comptroller of Currency, the NCUA, who does small credit unions, those types of places. And they said, when you think about risks, there's kind of two ways to split it. You need to analyze the applications that you're building and your attack surface to say, are you essentially a small bank with a small footprint, or are you a big bank where you have a large footprint and a lot of things you have to worry about? And then, depending on this is going to influence where you need to be. So if you're in the moderate level, so you're a medium-sized bank, if you're spending tons and tons of stuff on security to be truly innovative in every possible way, you're probably overspending and you don't need all of that complexity. However, on the other side, if you're a medium-sized bank and you haven't at least achieved baseline security maturity, well, you're going to have problems because you're going to be a target and you haven't built the safeguards in your organization to really protect your business. And so when we think about protection, a lot of times in security, we'll think of a traditional castle, right? We have people who want to come in, and we'd have to build a moat and we'd have a drawbridge, and they would typically analyze how big the moat needed to be based on the height of the trees around the forest. So that kind of told you, what are the likelihood of coming over and some of the impacts. And then afterwards, you'd have walls, and you'd have maybe an inner wall or an inner tower, and your holy of holies treasure chest with all your crown jewels in the middle. And so this defense in depth approach applies today. Now, there's some things that have to change, right? You can't just always expect one perimeter firewall to keep everything protected. That's why you're seeing this whole emergence right now of things like zero trust security, where we're hardening everything. But we have a layered approach of cloud devices, applications, network devices, protecting users, classifying your data, a systematic approach that holistically improves security for the organization. And when I started thinking about this, I started reading a lot of Sunil Yu's work. And he built the cyber defense matrix where he identified the NIST functions up top: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And these first two on the left are called anything that's left of the boom. Boom is this column line right here where bad things happen and they're in your network. And he applied a overarching layer of technology, of devices, applications, network data, and these sorts of things allowed him to see where people are spending money. Right, maybe we're putting all of our money in identify and protect and we don't have enough systems in place on recover. Or maybe we're putting a lot of things into application layer, but we've really forgotten about data layers. So it helps you identify where to prioritize your resources and do some portfolio allocation spending. And I think this is really valuable. It brings a lot of skill. But when I started talking to the business owners, they don't care about tech. They just want to know they're secure. So we need to think about it in terms of what they care about, and they care about threats. What are the things that could cause material loss to my organization? I.e., if I'm $100 million company and something has the ability to take $10 million of my revenue, well, I just lost 10% of all of my income. And that may be the only profit the company actually makes. So that would be what's considered a material loss. And so I started doing a lot of research and reading on some of the cyber insurance companies. And as I did that, I started looking at, well, what are some of the greatest threats to today? And it's no surprise phishing is number one. You know, every organization really has phishing all the time against them. Ransomware has definitely been the big leader over the past year, 2 years of, you know, most companies are being targeted, often through phishing, but there's some slight nuances. And then we're seeing web application attacks. These are the OWASP top 10, if you think of the SQL injection, the cross-site scripting. And then last but not least is vendor and third-party data loss. And we're seeing places like Facebook who have, you know, hundreds of companies that they share data with, or this could be a bank sending data to Equifax, who may do FICO score processing. And if they lose your data, well, that just is not good. And so, how can we think of threats and then overlay these with the NIST functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover? So now we have a defense in depth plan. Having a risk register that says, hey, we're going to train our users on phishing is a really weak defense. It's important, it provides value, and it teaches folks. But if that is all you do, you are destined to fail. So we need to really start to think about what are ways that we could provide this defense in depth approach. You know, I'm going to limit what each user can do by having good active directories and access management. I might identify folks who are at high risk within the organization. So anybody who has their name as an executive, like the CEO or chief finance officer for the company, I need to watch those accounts a little bit more. And then for protection, you might use things like a proof point or some other email security based solution that really blocks your bad guys from sending phishing through your email filters. You're also going to have multi-factor authentication. So it takes a lot of things to get right to really steal email and if somebody's going to target you with business email compromise. And then you can see here how the list continues on and on and on, right? So what you want to do is identify safeguards at each phase of NIST functions. So you can say, well, if I couldn't find all the accounts that were vulnerable, how might it protect them? And if protection didn't work and the bad guys actually got in, how would I know? Well, I'd have to detect that. And then if I couldn't detect it, but I saw, these systems were down or having issues, how would I respond and recover? And when you do this, what you're going to see is there might be some things you're really good at, and there might be some things that are very difficult for you, right? You might find that we're a new company, right? And our ability to do really good EDR is hamstrung by our budget for free EDR software, which is very terrible. But if we just got a product that maybe changed it and gave us a top quality notch EDR software, we might see some huge gains. So before we go down this approach, we need to think about how can we monitor and put metrics. What gets inspected is something we can expect, right? So we need to look at what metrics do, and the FAA has a great understanding. They say we need to detect when undesirable states are imminent because that's what leads to accidents. We need to avoid or prevent accidents, especially when they seem inevitable. And when they do happen, how can we lessen the damage so that it isn't as costly for the business? And so here's this guy going on this little raft. He's surrounded by sharks, right? That's a pretty nerve-wracking scenario, I would imagine. And he's trying to get to the goalpost here. So what we might say is we're not going to do everything, but we're going to do some of these things really good. If we try to say everything is a priority, what we're saying is nothing is a priority. And so we can cherry pick a couple things where we really want to focus. So maybe for phishing, we really want to focus on training users with phishing simulations to increase our phishing reporting rates. With ransomware, it might be all about how do I have offline backups? Because if we can write malware and destroy all the backups, well, that's no good. But if I can make sure I have a read only copy of the backup or an offline copy, well, I can still survive. Yes, I'm going to lose 1 day or 1 week's worth of data, but I'll be able to come back up and be able to function as a business. So as we start to cherry pick a couple of these different functions and uh, tools or processes, we can really allow the organization to prioritize. And these could be the areas where we want to improve the most. So maybe AppSec testing is only done by 30% of the production releases, and we want to get it to 100% and put it in a pipeline, right? And so this allows us to focus, and what we need to do is tie these back into metrics that we can essentially optimize for the organization to focus on. And so what I think is really helpful when we look at that metric, that threat and safeguard matrix, is it clarifies how we're defending in depth. And and what I did is I created a simple scorecard here where we have people, processes, and technologies. And then we can just look for key metrics that we think are really important. So, patching. This is really a fundamental right now where you're seeing most organizations deploy a vulnerability management tool, something like a Qualys or a Tenable or a Rapid7, where you put an agent out on all your servers and you can identify what things need to patch. And then you might say, okay, my servers on average take about 90 days to patch based off the time to close out each of these vulnerabilities. And my goal is to get to 15 days on the server. So I have this delta. And every quarter, what we want to do is show progress. So if it gets better, let's show it in green. If it gets worse, let's show it in red. If it stays the same, just put it as yellow and show it as stagnant. And so here we can look through different metrics like defect density. How can we take the number of high or critical vulnerabilities in an application and divide it by the number of servers? And then this gives us a fair way to compare applications, because you may have one application with 100 servers And so if there's one vulnerability across the golden image of everything, well, they already got 100 vulnerabilities. And this other app that only has 2 servers, they only have 2 vulnerabilities. So it's not fair when you're comparing those 2 apps. But if you say, how many vulnerabilities per server do you have? Now you can really compare that and gamify how we're going to improve vulnerabilities within an organization. And you set certain goals. Some of these may be unattainable, like having 0 defects is often very unattainable for organizations, but it draws, how do we get a little bit closer to that every quarter or every month? We may also have configuration focuses, phishing. I put over here the third-party risk assessments. So you might use a Cloud Security Alliance or a SIG assessment to identify how different applications which are hosted by third parties meet all of your pieces. So this really, when it comes down to it, allows us to take the TASM and identify improvements and give the organization to actually measure the CISO and the CIO on their effectiveness to champion the security cause. It's not we're just going to be perfect. We give them tactical measures to really show how we advance the cause. And what we need to do is really map findings to business exposure. So it's not just, hey, I have 10,000 vulnerabilities in my applications. It's, these 5 applications which are financially significant to the company have major critical vulnerabilities. And these could cause harm to the company. And now we're speaking in the terms of the business. Or these applications here, which are financially significant, take 3 days to fully restore. But yet you have business requirements that you restore in 2 hours. So if something happens, we're not going to be able to meet your business objectives. And then we can start to show some of the exposure and risk. And as we do this, there's certainly 3 lines of defense in an organization. You have the strategic folks who are owning the risk, the IT people building it out, but normally the application is owned by a business owner. You have the cyber department and risk management, the second line that really oversees and polices in many ways. And then last but not least, you have audit, who's really that next line of defense. And when we look at the matrix, what we can see is there's more than one way to leverage the matrix and make good things happen. So simply by adding one more column to the left side, instead of it just being a cyber focused metrics, it can be a matrix that you can use inside your risk committee. And so here we can have your Office of Compliance, who does all your anti-money laundering there. You could have your finance officers, HR, legal issues, everybody bringing different threats to the company. And what we're going to do is help them think about how to build a defense in depth approach. Like when we see anti-money laundering, it's not just, is it an issue and how likely is it to occur, but how could we identify where it could occur in our company? Well, maybe here's the 5 applications that take money from customers. And how would we stop this? Well, is there checks in the tools to identify sorts of when people are putting more than $10,000 and you have to file suspicious activity reports? And so as we do this, this really helps us do it. But what it also allows us to do is act like a Roman phalanx. That's where you see these like walls of shield where each of the soldiers is putting their shields to help as a group, and they form this kind of turtle, if you look. And when that happens, we can say, how might we be able to use cyber to help HR, or how can cyber help compliance? Could we put some cybersecurity controls that would strengthen our anti-money laundering? And maybe we take their logs and put them into our logging and monitoring solution, or have them feed our SIM where we can alert on certain activities. And maybe HR can help us, right? If we're worried about insider threat, what are things that they could put in place to help us? And so together we start working more effectively as a risk committee, and it can even highlight things, right? If cyber has the highest risk for the company, it's really powerful when you have your chief legal officer saying, I think we need to give cyber more money because this is a big risk that we can't stop, and it's important for the risk committee to tackle this. Additionally, we can also start to think about threat modeling and how we can do this in a consistent way. So let's just look at this diagram here on the left. This is a simple data flow diagram, and it's about credit card transactions. That's why here you'll see a card holder data, right? And these are credit card, let's say PCI data that you'd care about. And so as if you were to take each of your application teams and say, I want you to do two things every time you do a threat model. I want you to produce a really good data flow diagram to show where data is moving between your application and anything it connects to. I need to also identify how that maps to a threat and safeguard matrix. So here, what we might have is developers go through this and identify, here's a couple vulnerabilities they're really worried about, right? And this is going to be really important for them to understand. So we might come in and through some secure developer training class, teach them about STRIDE, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege, as well as lateral movement. And then when we do this, they'll start to put some of these threat and safeguard matrix in play, where they'll say, I'm worried about out of memory on my application. I'm worried about SQL injection, or I'm worried about a rogue admin. And as they fill this out, this becomes something that they can put in upcoming stories to strengthen and improve their application. But what it also allows us to do is if we get 20 different application teams, each creating their own threat and safeguard matrix for their own application, we might be able to see trends. Perhaps we're seeing that a lot of applications need better logging of privilege activities. And maybe we don't have a Splunk or a Elasticsearch tool to really perform this logging and monitoring. Well, this could be something we'd identify in our next year budget, because the majority of developers are asking for something to help improve detection. So this is a way where we can use this as a way to influence our portfolio, our strategy, and really make better security. Another way you can do, if you want to take it to a very tactical way, is look at your CSOC. So you can say, okay, if we start to really go through the MITRE attack framework, we could look at where most people are coming into our organization and what do we have to worry about. So we might see, based on statistics from CISA, that the majority of execution is via PowerShell attacks. And then we could work with our CSOC to say, okay, let's say PowerShell is a big threat for us. How could you identify where PowerShell could be run? How could we protect against it? Is there any Windows GPO group policies we could apply and block PowerShell, or provide it only in use for admins? And most people are not admins. They have to use a PAM to get a token for that. And so we can start to flesh these things out and go as much into the detail as we want to. We can take it as broad as we need to and work across a risk committee. And we can use it to really influence and change the culture of application security through identifying consistent trends. So that's a little bit about what I built here. And I want to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Ross. Any questions from the audience? While we're waiting for folks to chime in, quick question. I always assume that when we have like a mutual connection, that it's your doing that found the mutual connection. How do you know Sounil?
So, I I just reached out to him because I was building this matrix and he was the one who built the other one, the cyber defense matrix. So I reached out to him in LinkedIn. I said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you about this." And since then, we actually talk about once a month. Where he's one of the smartest guys I enjoy talking to. He likes where I'm going with my model, and right now we're working on some ideas to take a new transparency approach to cyber.
Quick follow-up before we kick it off to Pete, who has a question, raised his hand in the Zoom client. Were you involved with getting Sounil to join the Cloud Security Solutions Forum a couple months ago with SANS? Because I was on a panel with him.
I was not. He did that on his own, but he's been around the industry for a very long time. He was the CTO at Bank of America before, so he's just well connected, and he is a great person to give back into the industry.
Awesome, Pete. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. This is something I've struggled with this question is something I've struggled with in my day job, and it's the notion you alluded to earlier of lateral movement, which is that a particular threat or a particular attack surface might be relatively innocuous to the business in and of itself, but you're not interested in the slightly out of date widget on my desktop. You're going to jump from my desktop to a file server onto somebody else's admin jump box and then into the data center. I've never found a good way to communicate that or assess that, or to drive home the point maybe that even what appears to be a minor vulnerability and a low risk can blow up to something pretty terrible given the right circumstances. Do you have any thoughts or experience on how you get that message across?
So, I mean, it really depends on where you're looking, right? So let's take the example of phishing a user, right? Most people don't have access to the core banking application that is the crown jewel of a bank, but they may not be that far away. It's that Kevin Bacon problem, if you will. So sometimes what people will do, and particularly red teams or pen testers, will run a tool like Bloodhound to say, "Hey, if I spearfish this one person and I can pull the Active Directory and get the credentials of where that person talks to, how many people do I have to get to go to domain admin?" And that's a simple way to show where the lateral movement needs to occur to drive some of those functions. Another way you might do that is if we think about on our application where I showed this card data holder environment. And let me just pull that up on the screen so you guys can see that. In this example here, what you might show is, hey, there's 3 vulnerabilities on this application. There's 4 vulnerabilities on that application. And and because we can demonstrate vulnerability after vulnerability after vulnerability, these things that we thought are internal and untouchable really aren't, because there's a way to pivot through the network. So sometimes just providing that visualization is really key. And that's where I come back to this story that you can tell from a cyber report card. So let me show you how I take these numbers to kind of tell that. On average, our servers today have 9 vulnerabilities that are critical or high, which means it may not be that difficult to get into our environment. And because we're patching these servers on a 20-day frequency, and the attackers are usually able to go from 0-day to exploit in 15 days after a vulnerability becomes introduced on something like bug track or whatnot, we may not be able to have a timely enough remediation plan. So our goal is we need to drop that by this amount and this. So you can start to tell a story with the metrics. And I think that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to take some bulk liberties of how things work or look in your environment. Other times you take a very tactical approach of showing how things flow through. Does that help at all, Pete?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? You guys are letting me off easy.
Going once. Going twice. All right. Well, you got off easy, Ross. We really appreciate you taking the time to present to us all. It was a great topic, and I will stop the recording right now.